Hey, what's up, Optimal Health Warriors, and welcome to another episode of the Optimal Health Show. In this week's podcast, we got Jill Cicciarelli to drop by and talk about all things fermented foods. Now, she's the author of the awesome book Fermented, a four-season approach to paleoprobiotic foods. As well, she's a graduate of the Institute for Integrative Nutrition as a holistic coach. So she really knows her stuff. Now, the first time I heard Jill, she was on Jimmy Moore's show, and she actually blew my mind away with information. That's why I have her on the show today. Now, before we actually get into today's podcast, I got a couple of things. Number one, if you haven't done it already, please head over to iTunes and leave a review. The more reviews we have, the more optimal health warriors we can have worldwide. And number two, this week's Optimal Health Warrior shout out goes to Gary Barnes. Gary, keep up the amazing work, brother. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy today's amazing podcast with Jill Cicciarelli. So once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Before we actually begin, I'm actually kind of curious. How did you actually get interested in this whole fermented world?
It came about kind of slowly. I'm very interested in old food ways, like how my great grandparents and before did things. I mean, food back then was so good and pure and not messed with in any weird science Frankenstein way. And it was grown in such a great way and prepared in such a great way that I just started in general just getting really interested in how food was prepared long ago. um, Before my grandmother passed, I was very close to her. She talked a lot about her growing up and things that they used to do in the kitchen and how they prepared things. So this was a theme for me to kind of think about how people prepared food from long in the past. And you part and parcel to that is fermentation. People have been doing it for centuries. It's something that is present in almost every culture of the world. I mean, it was almost inevitable that I stumbled upon fermentation based upon this interest that I had. Yeah, so I started kind of reading a lot about it, and reading about how important it is to keep your gut biota healthy, and um, this hobby interest of mine, and then my professional interest as a health coach kind of came together. Like, wow, this is an old food way, and it's so good for you, and people can do it themselves. And yeah, it was inevitable how all the things came together.
That's amazing. So for people who don't know what fermented foods are, can you kind of open up that kind of book and explain to us what are fermented foods?
Yeah, fermented foods are it's basically any kind of food that has a carbohydrate in it that you introduce in one way or another bacteria to, and let that bacteria work on the carbohydrates in that food. It changes the flavor and texture of food. It changes the nutritional profile of the food. Yeah, that's basically in a very condensed elementary nutshell what it is. It's the introduction of beneficial bacteria into food.
So what are some common everyday foods that people may be eating that maybe they don't know that's fermented?
Well, the most common one I tell people, yogurt. Like when I say, people will say to me really often, I don't even know what this is. This is such a crazy thing. I probably have never had this. And I said, hey, have you had yogurt? Oh yeah, I guess I have had yogurt. Sauerkraut, like you mentioned, is fermented. Vinegar, any kind of alcoholic beverage like wine, beer, that's all fermented. Cheeses are fermented. Um, you can ferment just about anything. Corned beef is fermented. There's a lot of cured meats that, like salami or pepperoni, are fermented. So yeah, these are things that most people in one form or another have had and probably haven't thought, hey, I'm eating fermented food. Or sourdough bread's another one that's a fermented food. So yeah, it's more common than people think.
Now, during your investigations of researching fermented foods, was there any moment that you're kind of like struck back about like, wow, this is so beneficial, like certain bacteria or like the nutritional properties maybe increased, pre fermenting to post fermenting, the actual context of that food increased?
Well, one thing that I think is really cool about fermentation is it increases the nutritive value in the food insofar as you get the good stuff from the food that you fermented plus the beneficial bacteria. But another really cool thing, and this is what I think is pretty super, you are better able to digest and extract nutrients from a food that has been fermented than the same food that hasn't. So the example I give really often is, you could get a leaf of cabbage, a raw leaf of cabbage right off the head and eat it, and it will give you vitamins and minerals and fiber and all these good things, but only so much. Your body can only take so much out of that leaf. Whenever you ferment that same leaf from that same head of cabbage, your body is better able to extract more of the good things that you would have gotten from the raw leaf because it's, they say pre-digested by these beneficial bacteria. So, if you eat a raw leaf of cabbage, it's like getting an 8 out of, the nutrient content, level 8. But if after you ferment it, it's like a level 10 or, turn it up to 11 if you're a Spinal Tap fan. Haha.
Yeah, I was always curious though, how in the world do we actually stumble across fermented foods? Like, think about it for a second. It's like, oh, I'm just gonna leave this milk on the table and I'll come back 3 weeks later and eat it or something like that. I always wondered,
Right.
how do we figure out to ferment stuff in the first place?
Well, it sort of goes along the same lines as, how did we think to crack open an egg and eat that? Or, you know, centuries and centuries and centuries ago when this first started, a lot of it was accidental. People found berries that had fallen from the tree and probably desperate for food and ate them, and they were probably a little bit fizzy and made them feel a certain way, and things just evolved from that. So I don't think anyone was like, I think I'll set this here and see what happens. It was probably accidental long, long, long ago, and then as things do, they've evolved and turned into really good things that we've found that are very beneficial to us.
You mentioned earlier that there's a connection between the probiotics of the fermented foods and the probiotics within us. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, we're, as human beings, made up of more bacteria than we are human cells. They outnumber us by 10 to 1. So, you know, I have human hair cells and skin cells and stomach cells and all these red blood cells and everything. And if you would count how many I have, there's 10 times more bacteria inside of us, and they do so much. I mean, science has just really begun to start to crack this code of how much this good bacteria inside us is really helping us. But they, do a really, really, really important job of protecting us from outside things that we might ingest. If I eat something that isn't good, it's the bacteria that live inside me that are going to help my body fight it off. My immune system is, not even my immune system, of course, but everyone's immune system is concentrated in your gut, in your small intestine. And the healthier that area of your body is, the healthier we are overall. So, yeah, it's something that, like I said, has been kind of colloquially known for many, many years. But now science is really starting to put some application to it and say, hey, there really is a lot of evidence for this. They're coming out with evidence that there's a gut-skin axis, a gut-brain axis, that the relative healthiness of our gut, or how robust our gut flora is, our gut biota, the bacteria that live inside of our small intestine, how healthy that is affects so many other parts of our body. So yeah, they've, like I said, just begun to really make a lot of serious scientific connections to how this is going. It's exciting.
It is. Have you done any of your own investigation to see certain species within, like, say, the species are, this type of species are found in sauerkraut, this type of species are found in maybe kale, or this types of species are found in kefir? I'm kind of fascinated about that maybe you can actually identify certain species in each of these fermented foods, and maybe
Yeah.
certain species are more or better, healthier for you than other species.
Yeah, I myself have not done any research like that. In my little home kitchen here, I don't have the kind of equipment or even the chemical know-how to isolate certain bacteria. And plus, it's kind of hard to isolate. One aspect or one method of fermentation is wild fermentation, where you just kind of take what's going on in the air and culture it in your food.
Mm.
And what I have in my air here in urban Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is different than what you have in your hometown and what somebody else has, halfway around the world. So it's hard to really pinpoint, like, oh, well, all sauerkraut has exactly these collection of bacteria. It's really hard to narrow that down, and I certainly don't have the background or the equipment or know how to do it. So no, I haven't.
Good point. Now, people are probably having all these thoughts in their minds right now that, they think it's kind of hard to create or to make fermented foods. Why don't you just explain to them in like the rundown how simple it is to actually make fermented products?
Yeah, well, there's a whole, as I mentioned before, a whole host of fermented products, and the most basic type of fermented goods that I always start with are just fermented vegetables. Get some vegetables, shred them up or cut them up, or you can even use them whole. But for instance, I always use sauerkraut. That's like the basic fermented food. The list of equipment that you need is a knife, a cutting board, and a jar. And the list of foods that you need in order to do it are a cabbage and a little couple tablespoons or a small handful of salt, and that's it. I mean, people can take it in a number of different directions and get really creative, and flavors and spices and all of that stuff. But the very basic thing that anyone needs to ferment anything is just the vegetable, something to put it in, a little bit of salt, and you're good to go. So it is extremely easy to get started. There are some ferments that are a little bit more complicated that require a little bit of extra know-how and things like that. But the very basics, super easy, super easy.
Now, you just mentioned the cabbage and everything. How long do you usually let it set before you think it's ready?
For me, and what I recommend in my book is it depends. And the reason why it depends is it depends on what your home is like, where you're storing this jar of shredded cabbage, we'll say. Right now, before we started recording, you and I were talking about how cold it is. And when it's colder, fermentation takes a little bit longer. So, some ferments that I started last week, I might let them sit 3 or 4 weeks before I feel like that they taste good to me, that they're done fermenting for me. But come summertime, when the temperatures are really warm and my home is a little bit warmer, the ambient temperature here is a little bit more comfortable, it might take 2 or 2.5 weeks. So I always tell people, do taste tests. After a week, taste it. If you kind of remember how it tastes, how it feels in your mouth. If you like it after 1 week, when it's wintertime or summertime, it doesn't matter. It's good, it's done, it's for you, and that's what you like. But typically, if you want, speaking of sauerkraut, like a sauerkrauty texture and flavor, it takes several weeks, and it could take as much as a month or 6 weeks, depending on how cold it is in your home.
Now, you mentioned in your book there's different types of fermented foods throughout the seasons. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, you can ferment, any kind of food, fruits, vegetables, produce, milk products, coconut milk, water. You can ferment tea. As a nutritional counselor, I try to tell my clients to eat with the seasons. Not only is it financially sound, but it's nutritionally sound. Do the best that you can, eating things that are growing now during this time of year, whatever time of year. And because you can ferment anything, and different things are in season in different times of the year, I structured my book by season rather than type of ferment. So, if it's winter time where you are and these things are in season, here's what you can do with those things. Here's how to ferment a lemon, like blood oranges and lemons are
you can ferment lemons?
Season now.
That's awesome.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to miss that. That's really great. It's really, really good. Really add a lot of flavor to a lot of cool dishes. But then, in the spring and summer and the fall, different things are in season. So, not only is fermentation itself really good, but fermenting things that are in season, I think, gives it an even more of an exciting nutritional punch because you're eating with what's going on around you.
I agree 100%. I actually teach it in my philosophies. The more in season you can eat, it's a win-win. You're getting more nutritional
Absolutely.
density, you're supporting your local economy. There's no downfall of it.
That's right. I agree.
And
High
that,
five.
yeah, high five for that for sure. Now, when eating fermented foods, is there certain guidelines they tell people at least include it 2 times a week or 3 times a week? Is there something like that?
I tell people first of all, don't go crazy because when I and I think I'm pretty much like other people. When I first started fermenting food, I was like, I'm going to eat as much of this as I possibly can. I'm going to have it breakfast, lunch, dinner, and in huge quantities. And please don't do that. I mean, that can really mess up the delicate balance that you have going on inside of you. I mean, a lot of people talk about how you need to keep your gut biota healthy and populated, but there is such a thing as it growing out of control. So you don't want to overwhelm your system, even though these foods are so wonderful for you. You don't want to overwhelm your system. I recommend to folks, eat a little bit. An 8-ounce glass of a fermented beverage, or a half a cup of fermented vegetables once a day. And if that works for you and you find that your body tolerates that and it feels really good, keep doing it. Some people are a little bit more sensitive, and that can take their stomach or make them feel a little bit weird. Cut it down to every other day, or 3 times a week, 2 times a week. But I start people off once a week, just a little bit, and go from there, whether you need to increase or decrease from there. But definitely don't overwhelm yourself with it because it's potent food. It's very good for you, but in modest quantity.
Now, is there any certain types of people with any medical conditions that maybe should consult their doctor, consult a practitioner before attempting to consume fermented foods?
Yes, yes, definitely. People whose immune system are compromised for any reason, if they're are undergoing chemotherapy, for instance, it's something that you want to talk to your doctor about. Pregnant and nursing women, sometimes people get um, a little bit nervous about the kinds, and with great reason, about the kinds of foods that they should eat. So yeah, definitely follow your doctor's orders about fermented food if you're follow into either one of those categories for sure.
Have you ever done any research within the histamine thing? I've seen some quite fascinating stuff of the histamine release within fermented foods.
I have too. I've not myself not done anything, but I too have probably read a lot of the same things you have. It is quite fascinating, but it's not something that I have personally worked on. I'm more of a recipe writer, kitchen experimenter rather than scientist. I mean, there's a little bit of science, of course, involved in
Of
fermentation, but
course there is.
I'm keeping yeah, I'm keeping it in my kitchen though. I don't have a lab.
So let's do this. Let's break down simple steps that people can maybe start fermenting foods today. So let's do a 1, 2, 3 guide for somebody, and let's pick
Okay.
sauerkraut. You mentioned earlier, but let's really guide them through the whole process of what it takes to create sauerkraut.
Okay. Um, Well, like I mentioned before, the list of equipment that you need is, a knife, a cutting board, and a glass vessel. Um, the list of, foodstuffs that you need is a cabbage and a couple tablespoons of salt. The glass vessel, probably about, a quart size, maybe like that big. None of this is, set in stone. It's not like you can have too much or too little at any point. So yeah, what you do, you cut up pretty finely the cabbage until it's in little shards. Um, I don't recommend that. I mean, you can if you want, but I really don't recommend that you use a food processor because sometimes that can make it a little too fine. Because as I mentioned, when you ferment food, it changes the texture of that food, and it can get, obviously. You think of raw cabbage as opposed to sauerkraut. Sauerkraut's a lot softer. So if
Mm.
it's too fine, it can kind of, disintegrate on you. So, cut it moderately thin, but not too, don't pulverize it, not too thin. put all of that in a bowl, maybe 2 or 3 tablespoons of salt or a small handful, and massage it in there. And I tell people, get your hands in there, get it clean hands, and just squeeze it and rub it in there. And you'll notice that the cabbage will start to get very watery. The water that's in the cabbage will come out because of the salt, and you want this liquid to come out. Once you have a nice bowl of cabbage that has leached out some of the water, the cabbage will sound rubbery whenever you're squeezing it. The texture will have changed a little bit. You take that plus the brine, that salty water that you've created, and you pack it very forcefully into your glass jar. And when I say pack it in there, I mean like pound it in there. I very often will get the end of a wooden spoon and just bash it down in there. You want it as packed tightly in there as possible. And you want that liquid to be in there, because fermentation takes place in what's called an anaerobic environment. That means without oxygen. So the fermentation is going to take place below that water line where there is no oxygen. You want to make sure all your little bits of cabbage are down below that line of water. And what you'll end up with is your jar packed full of cabbage, and at the very top you'll have a little bit, maybe an inch or so of water up there, and you want to make sure all the cabbage is underneath. Don't cover it. If you do want to cover it, maybe put something porous on top, like a piece of cloth that you've secured with a rubber band, or I often use coffee filters that I've secured with the rubber. Put it on your countertop and just let it sit there. Check on it. It's very common for little bits of mold to appear on the surface of the water. Just simply scrape it off. If water evaporates, just put a little bit more in there, a couple of little teaspoons or tablespoons or whatever, just to make sure that cabbage stays below the water. And then check it. After a week, taste a little bit of it. How does it taste? What's the texture like? Does it taste like sauerkraut? If it's not quite there, leave it for another week or another 3 days or whatever. And just keep checking it until it tastes like sauerkraut to you. What you like, the flavor that appeals to you. Once it's reached that point, you can cover it with a lid and store it someplace cold, in the refrigerator if you have a basement or garage. And what that does, storing it in someplace cold, it slows down the fermentation process to almost standstill. And I say almost a standstill because it never really stops. While the fermentation in room temperature, whatever temperature my living room is right now, it will go pretty vigorously, and it'll take a while, but it'll go pretty fast. But I will, in essence, turn the speed down to almost nothing whenever you put it in some place cold. Because when you eat it, when you taste it, whenever it tastes good to you, you want to keep it in that state because that's what you like, right? That's the way it tastes good to you. So keeping it in someplace cold turns the fermentation speed down almost to a stop. But it doesn't totally stop. So even whenever you store it in your refrigerator or wherever cold storage place that you have, it will slowly age and ferment a little bit, and the flavors will develop even more. And some people really dig that. They'll have jars of sauerkraut in their refrigerator for months and months and years even. Sometimes people will keep just to see how the flavors develop and evolve. It usually doesn't last that long around my house. My husband and I, eat it pretty quickly. But, that's a really cool thing about fermentation, is that the flavor profiles are endless because you can let things just take off. So yeah, it's as simple as cutting up cabbage, salting it, packing it in a jar, and letting it sit on the countertop.
That's amazing. Now, you recently released a book all about fermentation. What can people expect to find in the book?
The book is in 2 parts. The first, I go over a history of fermentation and the history of different types of ferments. And then I go through 16 different types of ferments, very basic, kind of exactly like the sauerkraut recipe that I just went over. It's no frills. It's very basic how to do these 16 basic types step by step. And if you want to just use those 16 recipes, you're going to be good to go exploring fermentation pretty thoroughly. But the second half of the book is a cookbook that, like I mentioned, is broken down by season. And it's how to use those 16 techniques that you read about in the first half and use things that are in season, and how to ferment a whole, host of things and get creative and use them in different meals throughout the day and different types of dishes. So yeah, it's a very basic book during the first part, and then it gets a little bit more adventurous in the second part.
That's amazing. Where can people acquire this book?
It's available wherever, like, major booksellers, Amazon.com here in the States as well as in Canada. Every major bookseller, thankfully, I have such a great publisher. They've made it available, in any major bookseller. And online. So yeah.
That's amazing. Jill, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Optimal Health Show. Where can people find more information about you?
Well, I have a little blog called firstcomeshealth.com, and I write about a lot of different things in addition to fermentation. I mentioned before that I'm a nutritional counselor, so I write about motivation and changing habits and things like that, as well as good clean diets and good clean food in fermentation, of course. I have a Facebook page and Instagram and Twitter, and you can find all the links to that on my website. But that's the best place to learn more about me and what I do.
Awesome. You're everywhere. Beautiful. Love it.
Yeah.
Jill, I want once again, thank you so much. You heard it, Optimal Health Nation. Go get Jill's book. It's going to be in the footnotes for sure of the show. Go check out her website. And do not be afraid of fermented foods. They will help you improve your health. Once again, Jill, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too. Thanks a lot.